The morning sun filtered through the large glass windows of the mansion, filling the hall with a golden glow. Everything inside the house was polished and expensive marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and antique furniture that looked more like pieces of art than things to sit on. In the middle of this luxury lived Alexander, a young millionaire known for his charm in public and his arrogance in private. Alexander believed that money was the only thing that measured a person's worth. His life was surrounded by parties, business meetings, and constant attention from people who admired his wealth. To him, those who worked for him were just part of the background, silent figures meant to serve him. Among those silent figures was Maria, the housemaid. She was in her late 20s, with a gentle face and tired eyes that held a quiet strength. Her job was to clean the rooms, arrange the books, prepare the tables, and make sure the mansion always looked perfect. She rarely spoke unless spoken to, not because she was shy, but because she had learned that in this house, her words rarely mattered. One Monday morning, Alexander was sitting in his study, sipping his expensive coffee and scrolling through the stock market updates on his tablet. Maria entered the room quietly with a tray of breakfast. She placed it carefully on the table, but something caught Alexander's eye. Next to the tray was a thin, worn-out book with a cover about business success and entrepreneurship. "What is this?" he asked with a raised eyebrow, picking up the book. Maria froze for a moment. "It's mine, sir," she said softly. "I was reading it before coming in. I must have placed it there by mistake." Alexander leaned back in his chair and laughed. "You? Reading about business success? What are you going to do, start your own company? A maid becoming a businesswoman? That's a good joke." The words were sharp, but his tone was even sharper. The other staff nearby heard him and glanced at Maria with pity. She lowered her head, hiding the small blush of embarrassment that crept onto her cheeks. "I believe everyone can learn something if they try, sir," Maria said quietly, gathering the tray. Alexander shook his head, still amused by the idea. "Dreams are for people who can afford them, Maria. You should focus on your work and stop wasting time on such nonsense." With that, he waved his hand dismissively, as if brushing away an insignificant thought. Maria nodded politely and left the room, but inside, her heart was heavy. She had heard such words many times before, not just from him, but from others who believed people like her were destined to remain where they were. However, Maria was not the type to argue or shout back. She believed in quiet determination. Every night, when her work was done and the mansion fell silent, she would sit by her small rented room's window, open her old second-hand laptop, and study online courses. Business basics, interior design, budgeting, whatever she could find for free, she learned. She dreamed of starting a small business one day, perhaps an interior design company that would bring beauty to even the simplest homes. For her, it wasn't just about money. It was about creating something of her own, something that would make her feel alive and respected. But mornings like this made her question herself. Was she foolish for dreaming? Did people like Alexander have the right to decide who was worthy and who was not? As she walked through the mansion's hall, she overheard Alexander on the phone with his friends. "Can you believe my maid? Reading business books. Some people really don't know their place," he said, laughing loudly. The echo of his laughter followed her as she carried on with her duties, but in her heart, a small fire continued to burn. Maria was used to being underestimated. She had faced hardship since her teenage years, working different jobs to support her younger sister after their parents passed away. Dreams, for her, were not luxuries, they were survival plans. The rest of the day went on as usual. Alexander hosted a lunch meeting with his investors, showing off his new sports car and boasting about a potential overseas deal. Maria moved silently among the guests, refilling glasses and clearing plates, as if invisible. But in her mind, she kept replaying his words, "Dreams are for people who can afford them." That night, She wrote in her small notebook, "Dreams are for those who work for them, not just for those who have money." The mansion stood tall, shining under the city lights, a symbol of Alexander's wealth and pride. He had no idea that within his own walls, a quiet maid was sowing the seeds of a future that would one day turn his world upside down. The days in the mansion passed with the same routine: polished floors, bright chandeliers, and the echo of Alexander's footsteps as he moved from one important meeting to another. For everyone working there, the mansion felt like a palace but also like a cage. Maria worked from early morning until late evening, keeping everything in perfect order. Yet, inside her heart, something kept whispering, "There is more to life than this." Every evening, after finishing her duties, Maria would return to her small rented room in the servants' quarters. The room was simple: a narrow bed, a wooden chair, a tiny desk, and a second-hand laptop that sometimes heated up too quickly. But to Maria, that room was her real world, the place where her dreams were being quietly built. While the city outside sparkled with nightlife and busy streets, Maria sat under the dim light of her old lamp, reading about interior design and business strategies. She watched free online lessons and took notes in a notebook that was almost full of sketches and ideas. Her dream was not about becoming rich overnight. It was about creating something meaningful, an interior designing service that could bring warmth and beauty to ordinary homes. She believed that everyone deserved a space that felt special, no matter how small or simple it was. But the words Alexander had said still echoed in her mind: "Dreams are for people who can afford them." Sometimes, those words hurt her deeply. Sometimes, they gave her strength. One evening, while Maria was arranging books in the study, Alexander entered with a group of his friends. They were laughing and talking loudly, wearing expensive suits and watches. On the table, Maria had left a few sketches she was working on for practice: a drawing of a small living room, redesigned with simple but elegant furniture. Alexander noticed them and picked one up. "What's this?" he asked, holding it like it was a piece of scrap paper. "They are just my practice drawings, sir," Maria said softly. Alexander smirked, showing the sketch to his friends. "Look at this. My maid wants to be a designer now. Maybe she will decorate my mansion next. Should I hire her as my personal architect?" His friends laughed, not with kindness, but with the same kind of laughter that makes someone feel small. Maria kept her eyes down, hiding the heat in her cheeks. She quietly collected the papers and left the room without another word. That night, she sat on her bed, staring at her sketches. For a moment, doubt crawled into her heart. "Maybe they are right," she thought. "Maybe I am just a maid. Maybe my dreams are too big for someone like me." But then she remembered the faces of her younger sister and the people she wanted to help: families who lived in small apartments, children who studied in corners without proper desks, mothers who dreamed of a little more comfort in their homes. "No," she whispered to herself. "Dreams are not only for those who are already rich. They are for those who are ready to work hard." The next morning, Maria woke up early as always. She prepared breakfast for the household and polished the glass tables until they shone. She moved like a shadow, doing her work silently, but in her heart, she had decided something: she would not give up, no matter how much Alexander mocked her. She saved a small part of her salary each month. It was not much, but slowly, a little fund was building up in her savings account. She spent nothing on unnecessary things. No fancy clothes, no expensive food. Only books, courses, and a few drawing materials to improve her skills. Meanwhile, Alexander lived the opposite way. He bought new cars without thinking twice. He threw big parties to impress people. He mocked the dreams of others but never worked on his own character. To him, Maria was invisible, a quiet servant who should stay in her place. But Maria's world was changing quietly. Every new lesson she learned added a brick to the foundation of her dream. Every sketch she drew made her vision clearer. She had no business card, no office, No team, but she had determination. One evening, while buying cleaning supplies for the mansion, Maria met an elderly woman in a small home improvement store. The woman was looking at curtain fabrics with confusion, holding a list in her hand. Maria, out of kindness, offered to help her choose colors that would match her cafe's interior. The woman looked at her with interest. "You seem to know a lot about this," she said. "I'm learning interior design in my free time," Maria replied politely. "Would you like to help me redesign my cafe? It's small, but I want it to feel warm and inviting," the woman asked. Maria hesitated for a moment. This was what she had been waiting for, a real chance. "Yes," she said finally, her heart racing. Little did she know, that small moment of kindness would soon open the first door to her dreams, a door that Alexander would never see coming. The city was alive with its usual rhythm: cars rushing past, small shops opening their shutters, and people carrying their daily hopes with them. Maria walked through the busy streets with a shopping bag in her hand, her mind still replaying the conversation she had with the elderly woman in the store. Her name was Mrs. Williams, a kind lady with silver hair and warm eyes. Mrs. Williams owned a small cafe that had been running for years, but it had lost its charm over time. The paint on the walls had faded, the furniture looked old, and the place no longer attracted many customers. She wanted to give it a fresh look but didn't know where to start. Maria had offered a few ideas while they stood in the store: soft colors, simple wooden tables, and warm lights to make the cafe feel cozy. Mrs. Williams had listened carefully, impressed by how clearly Maria could explain her vision. "Come by my cafe tomorrow," Mrs. Williams had said. "I cannot pay you much, but I want someone who understands beauty in simple things." Maria agreed, even though her schedule was already full. She would finish her work at the mansion during the day and visit the cafe at night. It would mean less sleep, but her heart told her this was the opportunity she had been waiting for. The next evening, after her duties were done and the mansion was quiet, Maria took a bus across town and arrived at the little cafe. It was as Mrs. Williams had described: faded walls, mismatched chairs, and a tired look that hid its true charm. "This place has potential," Maria said with a small smile. For the next few days, she began to plan. She used her savings to buy small items like fabric samples, paint swatches, and a few simple decorative pieces. She sketched ideas at night, her fingers tired but her heart excited. Every time she walked past the cafe, she imagined what it could become: a place where people could feel at home, where stories could be shared over warm cups of coffee. Meanwhile, life at the mansion continued as usual. Alexander was busy showing off his wealth to new investors. He had no idea that his housemaid was running between two worlds, serving him by day and building her future by night. One morning, as Maria placed his breakfast on the table, Alexander glanced at her. "You look tired," he said carelessly. "What's wrong? Too many fairy tales keeping you awake?" Maria smiled faintly but said nothing. She had learned that explaining her dreams to someone who didn't believe in them only wasted energy. A week passed, and the cafe slowly started changing. Maria painted the walls in soft cream tones, replaced the old curtains with fresh ones, and rearranged the furniture to make the space feel more open. Mrs. Williams watched her work with admiration. "You have a gift, Maria," she said one evening as they hung a new set of lights. "Why did you never study this professionally?" Maria laughed softly. "Life doesn't always give you the time or money to study, ma'am. But I believe learning never stops." The grand opening of the renewed cafe was a quiet event, but word spread quickly in the neighborhood. People who hadn't visited in years started coming back. They loved the warm lights, the cozy seating, and the way the place felt alive again. Maria stood in the corner that evening, watching customers smile as they sipped their coffee. For the first time in years, she felt the taste of her dream becoming real: not a full success, but a small beginning. Mrs. Williams paid her modestly, but to Maria, the real reward was the experience and the confidence it gave her. She now had a small portfolio photos of the cafe before and after the transformation. Back at the mansion, Alexander remained unaware. He continued his routine of long meetings, expensive lunches, and loud gatherings with people who admired his wealth. To him, Maria was still just the quiet maid who dusted his shelves and cleaned his windows. But Maria's evenings grew busier. More people started asking Mrs. Williams about the new look of her cafe. A few even requested Maria's number, hoping she could help with their small shops or home corners. One rainy night, as she returned to her room after another long day, Maria opened her notebook and wrote, "Every small step is still a step forward." She didn't have a company yet. She didn't have an office, a big team, or even enough money to quit her job. But she had something far more valuable, proof that her dream was not just an idea in her head. It was real. It had touched lives. The mansion still stood high on the hill, its windows shining with Alexander's pride, but the quiet maid inside it was no longer just a servant. She was becoming something else, someone who dared to dream in silence, even when no one believed in her. Little did Alexander know, the woman he once mocked would soon become the very name people admired in his city. The city continued to move forward, and so did Maria's quiet journey. Weeks turned into months, and her small steps started forming a path. The cafe project had become a topic of conversation in the neighborhood. Customers praised the new warm look, and slowly, word spread beyond the small street where it stood. Maria still worked in the mansion, but something inside her had changed. Each morning, when she tied her apron and carried the cleaning supplies, she no longer felt like just a maid. She felt like a learner, a dreamer, and soon she believed she would be more. Her evenings were now filled with new tasks. Mrs. Williams introduced her to a shop owner who wanted a small redesign for his bakery. A neighbor wanted advice about arranging furniture in her living room. These were not big projects, but for Maria, they were golden chances to practice, to build her name, and to slowly save money. She kept her earnings safe. Every coin, every small payment went into her savings account. It was still a humble amount, but she treated it like a treasure chest for her future. Meanwhile, Alexander's world was starting to show cracks, though he did not notice them at first. He was a man used to living with pride and noise, big parties, expensive dinners, and constant praise from people who wanted his favor. But in the background, his business was losing balance. A few of his overseas deals failed because of his quick and careless decisions. A new investment that he had been boasting about turned out to be less profitable than he claimed. His advisors warned him to cut down his spending and focus on stability, but Alexander dismissed their concerns with a wave of his hand. "I have built this empire," he said one evening to a friend during dinner. "It cannot fall because of a few weak months." But the weak months continued to grow. Maria noticed his temper changing. He began arriving at the mansion late, frowning more often. Sometimes he would snap at the staff for small mistakes, a glass placed slightly out of line, a curtain not perfectly straight. Maria stayed quiet and did her work, knowing his world was not hers to fix. At night, however, her own world was becoming brighter. She finally registered a small business name using her savings, Humble Spaces, Interior Design. The name reflected her vision, to create beauty without extravagance, to make homes and shops feel alive with simple, thoughtful changes. She did not yet have an office. Her laptop and sketches were her tools. Her clients were mostly small shopkeepers, old cafe owners, and families with modest incomes. But they appreciated her honesty and her style, clean, warm, and affordable. One rainy afternoon, Maria returned to the mansion after meeting a client. She passed by Alexander in the hallway as he argued on the phone. "How could this happen?" he barked into the receiver. "You said the deal was guaranteed. Now we're losing money. Fix it now." Maria glanced at him briefly but said nothing. She walked past quietly, just as she always did. Alexander turned his frustration toward his staff more often now. One evening, as Maria arranged flowers in the hallway, he muttered, "Dreamers are useless. People should know their place." Maria heard him but kept her head low. Inside, she felt a spark not of anger, but of strength. She remembered the very words he once threw at her, "Dreams are for people who can afford them." Little did he know, the quiet maid he mocked was slowly building something far more stable than his restless empire. By the end of the year, Maria's small business had handled 5 projects. She had earned enough to leave her rented room in the servants' quarters and move into a tiny studio apartment in the city. It was still simple, but it was hers. She sent part of her earnings to her younger sister for her education, something she had always promised to do. The rest, she reinvested into her growing dream: better tools, a small website to show her work, and a few advertisements in local community boards. At the mansion, Alexander noticed Maria was more distant, not in her work, but in her presence. She moved with quiet confidence now, not rushing nervously like before. It puzzled him, but he was too busy fighting his own problems to ask why. The mansion, once full of his loud parties and bright evenings, grew quieter as his debts began to whisper behind closed doors. But even then, Alexander could not imagine that one of his own staff members was already on a path that would one day turn his world upside down. Maria, on the other hand, was no longer afraid of the future. She was rising, step by step, from the shadows of the mansion that once made her feel small. The mansion stood as grand as ever, its lights glowing each night like a jewel on the hill. But behind those walls, things were no longer the same. The laughter that once filled its halls had grown faint. The parties were fewer, and the guests who once came eagerly now visited less often. Alexander was restless. His overseas projects had failed one after another, and his investments were losing value. The very people who had praised him started giving excuses to avoid him. They no longer saw him as the man with endless opportunities but as someone slipping from his peak. Maria, meanwhile, continued her steady climb. Her small company, Humble Spaces, had completed more projects. She had now worked on a few family homes, a bookstore, and another cafe. Her work was being noticed because it brought life into spaces without costing a fortune. She had saved enough money to think about her next step, leaving the mansion. It was a decision that made her heart heavy. The mansion had been her workplace for many years, it had given her food and shelter when she had nowhere else to go. But it had also been the place where her dreams were mocked and where her worth was often questioned. One quiet morning, Maria knocked on the study door where Alexander sat reading papers. "Yes, what is it?" he asked without looking up. "Sir, I want to inform you that I will be leaving my job here," Maria said calmly. "I have started my own business, and I want to focus on it fully now." Alexander finally looked up, frowning. "Your own business? Don't tell me it's that silly design thing you used to draw at night." Maria nodded politely. "Yes, sir. It has been growing, and I believe it is time for me to give it all my attention." Alexander leaned back in his chair and laughed, though this time, the laugh was short and a little bitter. "Good luck cleaning other people's houses in a fancier way," he said, waving his hand dismissively. Maria simply smiled. "Thank you, sir, for everything." She left the study quietly, leaving behind the world she had once been trapped in. Days turned into weeks, and life in the mansion grew heavier for Alexander. Debts began to press on his shoulders. The luxurious cars were now more of a burden than pride. He started selling a few to cover his losses, but it was never enough. The large parties stopped completely, and the staff slowly began leaving for better jobs elsewhere. For Maria, life was challenging but hopeful. She worked day and night, managing clients, handling finances, and planning new projects. She made mistakes sometimes, but each mistake became a lesson that helped her grow stronger. Her name started appearing in small local magazines and online blogs as a self-made designer who brought warmth to simple homes. People admired her story, how a woman with no big degree or family fortune was creating something beautiful through honesty and hard work. Back at the mansion, Alexander faced the moment he had never imagined. One winter afternoon, he sat with his lawyer, papers spread across the table. "The mansion will have to be sold," the lawyer said. "It is the only way to cover most of your debts." Alexander stared at the documents in disbelief. The mansion was his pride, the symbol of his success. Losing it felt like losing a part of his identity. "No, there must be another way," he murmured, but the numbers spoke louder than his pride. The sale was announced quietly. Few people knew about it outside his circle, but those who did whispered about how quickly fortunes could turn. Maria heard the news weeks later through a friend who still worked in the mansion. She did not smile or celebrate. She simply nodded and said, "Life has its ways of teaching us." By then, her own life had taken a full turn. She had opened a small office, just a single room with 2 desks and a wall covered in her project photos. Her younger sister now worked with her part-time, helping with emails and scheduling clients. Maria often remembered the days when she would clean those marble floors, listening to Alexander's laughter as he mocked her dreams. She did not carry hatred in her heart, only a quiet sense of how far she had come. The mansion, once a place of pride and noise, now stood waiting for its next chapter. And Maria, unknowingly, was walking toward it not as a servant this time, but as someone whose name would soon be on the title deed. Winter had passed, and the city was slowly waking up to spring. The trees along the streets were turning green again, and the air felt fresh with new beginnings. Among those beginnings was the mansion that once belonged to Alexander. For months, it had stood quiet, waiting for a buyer, its tall gates closed to the world. One bright morning, Alexander returned to collect the last of his belongings. The once lively mansion felt empty. The grand hall where parties once echoed was silent. The walls that had seen his pride now held a cold stillness. He walked slowly, his expensive shoes clicking on the marble floor, but his steps felt heavier than ever. He was no longer the man who had mocked others with confidence. He was a man learning how quickly life can change. The lawyer had told him that the mansion had been sold, and the new owner would be arriving that day to take over. Alexander did not care to know who bought it. He only wanted to leave quietly, without facing more whispers from the world. As he stepped outside, a black car entered the driveway. It was sleek but not loud, elegant, yet humble in its presence. The door opened, and a woman stepped out, dressed simply yet with quiet grace. Her hair was tied neatly, her smile calm but confident. Alexander froze. His eyes widened. "Maria," he said, almost in disbelief. The housemaid he had once mocked now stood before him, not in her uniform, but in a tailored dress with a folder in her hand. "Yes, Mr. Alexander," she said politely. "I am here to take ownership of the mansion." Alexander felt a strange mix of shock and pride fighting inside him. "You? How is this possible?" he asked, his voice unsteady. Maria looked around the mansion, her eyes softening as memories filled them. "Life has its ways," she said gently. "I worked hard, started my own company, and little by little, it grew. This mansion came for sale, and I saw it as a chance to build something more." The staff who remained stood at a distance, their eyes wide with surprise. They remembered how Alexander had laughed at Maria's dreams, and now, they were witnessing a moment no one could have predicted. Alexander tried to find words. I never imagined," Maria interrupted kindly, "none of us know what the future holds, sir. I don't come here to boast or remind you of the past. I come here to begin a new chapter." She walked through the hall, her steps soft but full of purpose. The same hall she had once polished every morning now felt different under her feet, not as a servant's space, but as her own. Alexander followed, still struggling with the truth. He remembered the days he had mocked her sketches, the nights he had dismissed her dreams as foolish. Now, those very dreams had bought the walls that once echoed his laughter. "Are you planning to live here?" he asked after a long silence. Maria shook her head. "No. This mansion will become the headquarters for my company. It will be a place where people with simple dreams can come and learn. Designers, workers, artists, anyone who wants to start small and build their future." There was no bitterness in her tone, no revenge in her eyes. Only calm determination. Alexander lowered his gaze. For the first time, he felt something he had rarely felt before: humility. "I misjudged you," he said quietly. Maria smiled faintly. "We all misjudge people sometimes. I used to think I was too small for this world. You used to think dreams belonged only to the wealthy. Perhaps both of us had lessons to learn." The air in the mansion felt lighter as her words settled between them. She turned to him and added, "I hope you find your way again, Mr. Alexander. Losing things doesn't mean losing yourself. Sometimes it is only the beginning." Alexander did not know what to say. His pride had no answer for kindness. He only nodded slowly, feeling the weight of his past words pressing on him. The sun streamed through the tall windows, lighting the room where their worlds had once been so far apart. Now, those worlds stood face to face, one rising from silence, the other learning to start over. Maria signed the final papers that day and took the keys. As Alexander left the mansion, he glanced back one last time. The gates closed behind him, not as a mark of defeat, but as a door he had to leave for a new journey. And Maria, standing at the steps, felt the breeze on her face. The place where she had once been invisible was now her platform to inspire others. The mansion stood once again full of life, but this time it was different. Gone were the loud parties and empty displays of wealth. In their place came soft music, the scent of fresh paint, and the quiet hum of people working with purpose. Maria had turned the grand halls into offices and creative rooms for her company, humble spaces. Young designers, students, and workers filled the space with ideas and plans. They discussed projects for small homes, cafes, and shops, places that needed care more than glamour. The grand dining room became a meeting hall where new ideas were born. The library, once closed to many, was now a space where anyone could read and learn about design, budgeting, and starting small businesses. Maria walked through the halls, not as a servant, but as a leader. She greeted her team with a warm smile and listened to their ideas. She remembered each corner of this mansion where she had once dusted the shelves, where she had served tea, where she had hidden her small sketches. Those memories did not make her bitter, they made her grateful for how far she had come. Her younger sister, now studying business, often helped with workshops in the mansion. Together, they built programs to guide people who wanted to start their own ventures but lacked guidance. Many of them were people like Maria, once was hardworking, underestimated, and full of dreams they were afraid to speak aloud. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Alexander stood outside the mansion gates. He had heard about the transformation and wanted to see it for himself. His life had changed in many ways since losing the mansion. The loud friends had disappeared, and the constant show of wealth was gone. But with that loss came something he had not expected: clarity. Maria saw him from the balcony and walked down to greet him. She was dressed simply, her expression calm and kind. "Good evening, Mr. Alexander," she said gently. "Would you like to come in?" He hesitated before stepping inside. The mansion felt alive again, but in a warmer, more meaningful way. The walls no longer held the heavy silence of pride, they carried the soft sounds of people creating their future. "I wanted to see what you made of this place," Alexander said quietly as they walked through the hall. "It's different. It feels real." Maria nodded. It was always a beautiful mansion. It just needed a new purpose. Alexander stopped near the staircase where he had once mocked her for dreaming. He remembered the laughter, the careless words he had thrown. Now, standing here as a guest, those memories felt heavy. "I was wrong about you," he admitted. "I thought dreams were only for people with money. I thought your place was to serve, not to build. But you proved me wrong in every way." Maria looked at him kindly. "Sometimes people don't believe in us because they have never seen another way. But life teaches all of us, in its own time." There was no anger in her voice, no prideful tone. Just a quiet truth. Alexander nodded slowly. "What you build here, it's more than wealth. It's respect." Maria smiled faintly. "Respect is built, not bought. That is what I want others to learn here. Dreams belong to those who work for them, not just those who start rich." As they stood near the tall windows, the sunset filled the mansion with gold and orange light. The same light that once shone on Alexander's pride now warmed a place built on humility and hard work. He turned to leave, but before stepping out, he said, "Thank you, Maria, for showing me that losing everything isn't the end. Sometimes it's the start." Maria watched him go with no bitterness in her heart. She believed people could change, just as places could change. The mansion became a story that spread across the city. People spoke of the maid who had once been mocked for her dreams and who now owned the very house where those dreams were laughed at. It inspired others, workers, students, mothers, and fathers, to believe that even the quietest efforts could one day shine. Years later, Humble Spaces became one of the most trusted design companies in the city. Maria hired many people who had once been ignored by the world. She taught them not just about design, but about patience, kindness, and courage. And the mansion? It stood tall on the hill, not as a monument of wealth, but as a home of hope.